Hi, everyone. I am, again, just really excited to be able to shape this conversation, moderate this discussion about data governance. I have three esteemed panelists here with me, starting with Dr. Fellner. He is the professor of computer science at TU Darmstadt. I have Dr. Stanley Young, who is the Advanced Transportation and Urban Science Program Lead at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's a federal entity. I have Trevor Tinnison, who is the Senior Manager and Public Policy and Communications Director for the Southern region for Uber. So in many of our panel discussions leading up to this point, we've had a lot of conversation about how do we align all the stakeholders around data? How do we bring all these people together? So we actually successfully did that here, as we have representatives from academia and the public sector, as well as the private sector, who are all dealing in different ways with data in the smart city. So I want to start off with the basics. Let's talk about value of data in the smart city. What is the value of data for each of you in your respective industries? And why don't we start with Dr. Young?
Okay, put me on the spot real quick. I liked the discussion earlier. They said, what is a smart city? I've been watching that space looking for a good definition, and one that really resonates with me is a city whose fundamental decisions are based on data-driven analytics and processes. In an earlier stage in my career, I was with the Kansas Department of Transportation in what they called pavement management. And that's when we brought science and data and technology. Prior to that, there was about $300 million in funding that the major district engineers arm wrestled over every year based on personalities. In a 10-year process, the pavement management system came in, brought into technology, measured everything, and then 20 years later, it's completely data-driven. The politics is taken out of it to the benefit of the citizens in the states. In an analogy, that's where we're driving smart cities today, bringing forth the pertinent information needed to make the wisest, most critical infrastructure investments for the city.
Excellent. Dr. Fellner.
Yeah, if I may continue, let me just add that sort of in addition to academia, I'm also directing a Fraunhofer Institute. And that Fraunhofer Institute, as Fraunhofer Institutes in general, sort of are responsible in Germany to transfer insight from basic research into applications. So we need a little bit put our fingers in the air to understand sort of what industry demands might be. So let me also look at that challenge, sort of what's the value of data through that particular glasses, and try sort of to bridge it a little bit from between basic research and the application field. Now, I absolutely agree sort of what you just said, and I think the definition of a smart city and to derive the definition of the value of data from there is certainly sort of a good approach. And I think if we summarize, then it's obviously the information at large we can derive from the data. Sort of qualified decisions should be based on properly analyzing the data, and the data should reflect the ground truths. I think data also is the key to giving answers to questions you might not have raised in the past, but might be raising in the future. And I think simulations here is clearly sort of the key. If you sort of try to come up with a better planning when you do maintenance work, be it on the roads or be it on the sewage system or wherever, you might first consider sort of when are the traffic peaks before blocking the traffic. Just as a small example. For optimizations, again, sort of to optimize systems, first you need to agree politically or business-wise sort of what your goal function is. You try then to optimize, but then optimization again should be based on qualified insight and on a proper and accurate data. So it's better planning. And sort of this balance between the precision on one side and the value on the other side is, if you look, for example, to China, one of the reasons why Tencent, for example, has recently acquired technology or licensed technology for flood simulations is that they try to become sort of a one-stop shopping supplier for economies, for communities, to provide smart city solutions. And again, sort of you see here the value of simulations in the context of flooding simulations. If the flooding happens, first of all, you would try to prevent any damage, but if it has to happen, then how would you react in terms of disaster management? So just a few examples.
Just a few. And Trevor, how about you?
Yeah, I think, at Uber, we've had a long-running debate, both internally and externally, on what the value of data is at our company, both from a product development and competitive reasons, but also the role that we play with cities and communities in which we operate, knowing that our data that we generate from our users and our products have significant value to cities and other stakeholders. I'll give you an example. We just announced at the end of last year a partnership with NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Organizations, and Shared Streets, along with some competitors with Lyft and Ford, where we're basically aggregating data in a shared format with NACTO and Shared Streets to really give value to cities in order to plan, to do development, to do infrastructure. And so I think, as we move into scooters and bikes and freight and Uber Health and self-driving cars, that generates tons of data. But we also have to be cognizant of the privacy of the user and the anonymity that people expect in using some services. So it's a constant debate for us, both internally and externally, and I think we've come a long way on where we were when we originally started the business, but there's a lot more work to do for sure.
Okay, so we've got a little bit about value down for each of your respective industries in the smart city. How about access? So do you have maybe some thoughts about barriers to or opportunities for access to data within your industries and across your stakeholders?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think, since the beginning of our company, everybody has wanted access to our data, whether that's regulators or city planners or city transportation departments or airports or ports. Everybody's wanted access. And I think we have had to decide, the first question I ask when somebody asks for, hey, can I have this data? My first question is, what problem are you trying to solve for? We have tons of data in many different formats that wouldn't be useful if we just dumped it to you, right? But if we know what you're trying to solve for, we can figure out what we think the best data set or analysis is in the right format to turn that over. I'll give you an example. When we enter into contracts with airports, airports want a lot of data. They want to know how long the cars are dwelling at the curb. They want to know where they're staging. They want to know how long they're on the entrance and exit ramps. They want to know when they come into certain facilities. And so we've had to work with the airports associations to say, what are you trying to solve for? Is it congestion? Is it pricing? Is it cost analysis? And come up with a good scenario by which we feel comfortable sharing that data in an aggregated way, and they find real value. And so we've launched a website called Uber Movement to share data with the public, which we've now are excited to integrate traffic speed data as a data set into that. And so I think we have tried to find what portals are appropriate to share that data. And Uber Movement we have found for us is the right way. But again, if there are one-off asks, we try to aggregate those in a way that we can provide real value without just dumping data to everyone and not having real solutions to problems people are looking to solve.
Well, I think you really drilled the hole in terms of pointing out the value of understanding what kind of data you might be offering and others sort of might be interested in. So one issue is a clear issue of standardization, but not only standardization in terms of formats, but also in terms of semantics. And I think what we're tiptoeing around a little bit is sort of, is there a data economy involved? Sort of, is it shared data you're willing to give away in order to create a good karma, or why you feel sort of in the long run there might be businesses starting up? And I think one of the reasons, at least sort of from the European side, and you're welcome sort of to contradict if this is not true for the US-American situation, but I think a lot of development is being blocked by a situation where sort of the data owner might be a bit reluctant to give the data away, because you don't know if the one consuming the data might not make a fortune of the data. So if it's just for another sort of good application, you might be willing to share, but if you give it away, so maybe for too low a price or you give it away for free, that is certainly blocking. And from the industrial exchange of information in production ecosystems or in medical ecosystems or in other ecosystems, logistics, we realized sort of some years ago that maybe it's valuable to invest in a reference architecture where sort of giving the data means that you also agree on the use of the data. So if I give you the data for a particular application, you're free to do so, but if you find a cool application which really generates a lot of income to your company, then I would like to renegotiate the deal, and the question is sort of what are the technical platforms to allow that. So I can only sort of, this was a marketing block for an initiative where currently 85 companies have teamed up with it's called internationaldataspaces.org, and you're really invited sort of to have a look at that, to become a member and sort of to shape the development. And the idea really is that you base on a clearly formulated contract which is technically supported, that the data you use for particular applications is used for the application and not for any other. So the really important part is that you keep the sovereignty on the data. You're not giving the data away and then it's gone. And I'm not addressing issues of sort of how do you update the data. Of course, these are all separate aspects of a contract. But I think the real critical issue for many years was, in order to give a boost to the data economy, we need to have mechanisms in place where you feel it's a level playground and you're not tricked by somebody else having a cool idea, or maybe a cooler idea developing later on, and then you have given away sort of all your assets.
So building contracts that where the ownership of the data belongs, the sovereignty of that data belongs to the data owner, but
Correct.
then sharing it based on agreement of usage. So we agree collectively that you will use this data for this purpose, therefore we are willing
Correct.
to share it with you.
And it doesn't prevent you sort of from giving sort of for certain applications the data away for free. But for others, you might retain the right sort of to sell that based on the application behind, so that you get your fair share in the income. So I can only invite Uber, for example, to look at that
Sure.
initiative
Absolutely.
and to join.
Absolutely.
Dr. Young, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, plenty. I don't know where to take this. The data economy, we had a whole workshop in the Department of Energy and how we're getting a sophisticated supply chain of information and data, just as sophisticated as we see in the normal monetary economy. I like the example of the airports. If you got an early agenda, you noticed my colleague Caleb Phillips was slated to attend this, and he has this project we're building. I like to use the term digital twin in cooperation with Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Kind of stay with me, I'll bring these threads together. I work with a lot of researchers, and their idea of data is, I'm a researcher, trust me, give me all your data. And they're kind of befuddled when industry doesn't follow along. But within this airport scenario, realize that all our major airports do a major reinvestment about every 20 years on the order of $100 million to billions of dollars, depending on the size of the airport. And with Uber and Lyft, I mean, I'm fascinated because it's been a century before we've had public mobility that's been privatized, a kind of a franchise model. And now we're sort of getting our way back to that, in that there's a business model around providing some public mobility. And now the conversation is, here's a major airport, say LAX, dumping upwards of $1 billion in major infrastructure for movement of people, and we want the ride-hailing community at the table. We have data to show that you're a significant, I call them the point of the spear of mobility as a service in airports, as I think is your second largest market next to bars or something like that. But we know people love it. How do we build and invest $1 billion in this airport to plan for 20 years, knowing that services like ride-hailing are only going to increase, and how do we get it right so we don't waste millions and millions of dollars? And that's where the data value comes in, whether it's bartering it for Uber or Lyft, or to say, hey, here's the purpose that we need the information in order to do appropriate planning so everybody wins.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, I'll just keep going with the airport example. I mean, airports have approached us and said, we need more data because we have invested in parking garages.
Right.
And we can no longer pay the debt service on the parking garages because people are no longer parking in these garages. And when we're planning out 20 years from now what our infrastructure looks like, we need to know what your service, your trip numbers are in order to do that. And I think that is a great use of data, right? If we're going to invest, if airports are going to invest public dollars into infrastructure that may not make sense years from now, we need to know that. The same example with hospitals. I was talking to a hospital CEO the other day, and he said, I am telling my team I want to stop building infrastructure at our hospital because I think the future of healthcare delivery is doctors and patients going in Ubers and Lyfts to and from their big CAT scan or big equipment. But other than that, you're going to have your pharmaceuticals, your specimens, and your medical devices delivered to your house. And you're no longer going to have to go into necessarily a Walgreens or CVS or come into the hospital. So that sort of sharing of data around infrastructure building, I think, is fascinating and something we've tried to lean in on.
So in a space where, from the government's point of view, there's all the residents are citizens of a community. However, those residents and citizens are partitioned across different private sector services. So you have competitors with Lyft, for example, or Waze, and they are using different services, right, that generates different data sets. How can government entities look at a problem and study it, being able to apply it across all of its residents if it's receiving data from just one private sector entity versus another?
I'll take a stab at it. I think this is certainly a hot topic among cities, and I think Los Angeles City Transportation Department is kind of the first to dip their toe into this very controversial topic, which is instead of regulating rideshare and scooters and bikes, how do we regulate the platform, right? And so what the city of Los Angeles has proposed is the city will create a dispatching model where they will say yes or no to the dispatches taking place on private companies' apps to better the usage of their infrastructure, right? And so what they have just proposed in our permit renewals for scooters and bikes is a real-time API that the city of Los Angeles will get, and in real time they can see who is booking a scooter and a bike and a TNC and a rideshare and follow that. We are fighting those proposals in China and Egypt, which is a very scary thing if you can back out of that data to see who's taking a scooter every day from their house to their job, and then you know who they are. That's a very scary thing that we're trying to protect against. But I think it is interesting that cities are starting to think, how do we aggregate all of these services, and is there a role for us to play in actually being the mechanism by which says, yes, that TNC trip can take place on Uber or Lyft, or yes, that bike trip can take place, given what they see and the information available to them. It's a new topic. I think it's one that's going to develop. I think LA and the City Transportation Department over there is kind of at the tip of the spear on this. And we have a lot of concerns, obviously, from privacy and competitive reasons. But I think it's something to watch, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
And is that taking place just over the jurisdiction of airports, or is that citywide?
Citywide, yeah.
Thoughts? Yeah.
I'd like to add, that's objective driven. What does LA want to accomplish? In earlier discussions, I tell people, why is the DOE represented in mobility discussion? The DOE's long been representative in alternative fuels, energy efficiency, and everything. They've come to realize in the last 5 years they have to take a look holistically at mobility, mobility per unit energy. And one of the things, I'm going to expose my geeky side here. I'm a control theory specialist in some senses. We don't have the observability or the metrics in this space to begin to put policy around. And the DOE recognized this, saying, how do we go from miles per gallon to mobility per gallon? And so we took a step back, and we went back to the drawing board, and we created something called the Mobility Energy Productivity Metric, which is a big name. It's based on accessibility theory and throw a little energy efficiency in it. But it is a fundamental metric. It's not perfect, but it's a starting place to say, how do we put in perspective quality of life with respect to mobility, and then index it to how we want to drive sustainability and energy. And I think this whole space of whether you call it equity or sustainability or mobility, as we get more data and better understanding, if we can get it to data-driven metrics, we'd be a whole lot better off in our data discussions with one another. So.
Yeah, I can only support this, and I think in large communities like Shenzhen area in China, for example, and growing from a few 10,000s of people to 40 million, so without data analytics and sort of tying all the data together, you would not be able sort of to manage mobility at all. And the interesting part is not that you so much as a regulator come in. I think you need to respond to situations where a traffic accident or sort of odd situations quickly sort of develop long queues for whatever reason. So if you rearrange the way one-way streets are being run, you immediately can see from the simulation that is unlikely to happen. So the standardization I mentioned before, I'm perfectly aware that standardization is not a very sexy topic. Because long standards, sort of what's in for me. But however, sort of I think there's a lot of productivity in there, because implicitly, sort of rather than sort of handing rules and regulations out, which makes not all of us happy, to put it mildly, bringing the data together so that you can effectively aggregate it without wasting enormous amount of time and losing information. This is the worst thing about it. You have these de facto standards, the company develops something because people were just too lazy to read the standards or standard developments. Usually they have been around for quite a while. But particularly the new generation we train, sort of if it hasn't been published in the previous 5 years, it's obviously not relevant. Unfortunately, sort of things are quite relevant. Some of the standards we should adhere to are as old as 20 years. So people had a lot of foresight developing concepts how to exchange data, not to lose information, not to lose precision, not to lose semantics. Sort of they're there. The question is sort of, are we willing to deploy it? And I think I can only fully support what you just said.
I was going to add, we're working with ASCE to get this concept of this mobility energy productivity metric into kind of stage 1 provisional standard, so to speak. And what you say resonates. We've heard the term a digital native applied to millennials. When we work with our data systems, I've interacted with a lot of smart cities, and they try to build these integrated design data environments. And all the data systems we built in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, I wouldn't call natively digital. They were digitally assisted manual processes, and then when you try to bring them up to today's standard, you hit one of these new programmers, and then they go back to a 15-year-old data system and realize 80% of the content is in this field called free-form text, and it just makes them pull their hair out. So we have a lot of evolution to do that when we get to pure digital natives, even in our data systems. I think it'll address a lot of that. But even then, standards across many areas helps bring these together.
Yeah, for the record, I think standardization is totally sexy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Don't worry about that. So I want to take our last few minutes. I can't believe this conversation's already almost over. To talk about opportunities. We talk so much about constraints, right? Like, from having worked in the public sector, by the time we're able to even think about how we can regulate something like all of these e-scooters that showed up on our sidewalks one day, the way that we're approaching the regulation of that technology is already obsolete, right? So what are some opportunities for communication, for transparency, for co-creation across all of these industries in the smart city?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, as mobility devices and services continue to innovate and expand, I think the challenge that we have as a private company is making sure that we stay competitive and that we continue to disrupt ourselves. I mean, I would have never thought when I started at Uber 4 years ago that in Sacramento, California, in January of 2019, we would do more e-bike trips than Uber rides, car rides, during rush hour. I mean, that was just unfathomable to me at the time. And so I think those sorts of conversations with cities and stakeholders of, here's what we're seeing, and here's where we think the industry is going. 4 years ago, I would have never told you that e-scooters would be all around these cities, right? So I think that we have to have an open dialogue with cities, but at the same time, private industry, and this is, I think, a knock against ourselves, is we've got to be a little more open with cities about what we have coming down the pipe, while at the same time making sure that we're staying competitive and somebody doesn't undercut us, right?
Right.
We disrupted ourselves by creating a self-driving division at Uber 4 years ago because we knew that this was coming. But there are some things that we're working on, like flying cars, that we don't know when that's coming necessarily.
Is that coming? Does that have to come?
2020 in Dallas, test flights. But I think we, having those conversations now is important. So I think there is a tension, but there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think the conversation should certainly still progress.
Great.
Well, I would address sort of a different line of opportunities. I absolutely agree. I think with integrated data, we might see applications we currently not dream about, and because opportunities are there. But one of the opportunities sort of we should also keep in mind talking about data and data economies is that with all the mobile devices, with all the mobility, sort of we might consider using those devices sort of to on the fly update our data. This is partly already done. It's not sort of really in the back of our minds set to the level that we automatically think sort of how could we use the data to aggregate. I'm not talking about personalization, which sort of I think is individual, something which we need to be careful about, that you generate profiles you don't want to generate. But on the other hand, some of the classic traffic mobility data are being used to point out there might be a traffic jam. But sort of there are many other ways sort of to keep the data up to date without having expensive flights over the city and things like that. So the on-the-fly data updated data acquisition is something we need. We haven't looked enough in detail into that particular area.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I interact a lot with state DOTs and MPOs, and there's been a data revolution in the last 10 years, and it didn't start with the smartphone. It started with the telematics when all these vehicles started getting GPS and reporting. And today, we still use the same standards as far as the information we need that was established decades ago. But when that community interacted with then, it's since expanded, the telematics community, they were able to get travel time and speeds that scaled literally globally at a price point that was 1/100th to 1/1000th of what it would take to do with traditional means. Okay. And I think those are good areas, like when cities say, hey, this data item has traditionally been expensive and very hard to collect, but we know we need it. That's an opportunity to have a discussion with some of the technology firms out there and say, is there a better way of doing it that brings benefit to the city and still protects all the privacy?
Excellent. Right, so when we step into our smart vehicles, which arguably we already are all driving, unless you're an e-scooter evangelist, there's all kinds of sensors that are collecting data and information about the vehicle that is being sent to companies like General Motors, for example, who are collecting that information in order to better their product. But that data may have value in other domains as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we are just about out of time. Any last words here on data governance? We're a tight-lipped.
Well, we need either we spend another half an hour or keep mouth shut. So either or.
Okay, great. Well, let's give a round of applause for our gentleman here.
Thank you.
Thank you.